Hello, dear friends. Today we have interview with Antony Phillips on the theme Scientology in the 50s. Hello, Antony.
Hello. Nice to see you and hear you.
Thank you. Antony, can you tell us how you get into the Scientology?
Yes, briefly, I was working, this was the age of 24. I was working away from home and I had two problems. So at Easter, I went and visited my parents who were in London. I was in Cambridge. And I told my father about this. And it just happened that my father had come into Scientology or Dianetics a little bit earlier. And I told him about these two problems. And he got this thing out. You have a picture of it, an e-meter, a very, very early e-meter, Scientology or Dianetics e-meter. And yeah, there it is. He put me on this e-meter and found out actually that I'd had a problem as a child with regard to sex, and he didn't know anything about it because we didn't talk about that sort of thing when I was a child. If you had a problem, you just kept it to yourself, sort of thing. But anyway, what happened was that he found out that it was really beyond him. He tried to run an engram, but he found it was beyond him. So he sent me to a field auditor in London. So for some time, I used to go up to London. I worked in Cambridge, which was, it's about a 2-hour train ride from London. But every day, every week, I came in for a course. And in the evening, I went to a field auditor, Scientology auditor called Dennis O'Connell. He lived in London, and I got auditing from him for about a year or so. So that was how I got into Scientology.
Thank you. And what is your training experience in Scientology?
Well, as I say, I got this field auditing for some time, and this was in 54. In 55, the auditor, in 55, there was a Scientology conference. Ron came over and held a conference. And my auditor had said to me that he thought I ought to get training. So I by then moved into London. I got a job in London. So I used to go up to London, HASI. HASI was the name of the Scientology organization. That's to say, the Hubbard Association of Scientologists International. And I went up there for my work in the suburbs of London. I went up there 3 evenings a week and listened to tapes and did some auditing and so forth. And this went on for 6 months. And then the course was supposed to be 6 months. But after I'd done it for 6 months, that became the end of the 1956, they decided that doing it 3 times a week wasn't the same as doing it every day for 6 weeks. So they extended the course by 6 months. And I was annoyed about that. So I decided to go over to the day course. I had 4 weeks on the day course. So, when I was on the day course, I got twinned up with a well-known, and now afterwards, a well-known auditor, Pamela Kemp. So we audited together, co-audited together. And then by then I had finished my course. So, yeah.
Thank you. So it was your first experience in with Scientology education, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Okay, Anthony, please tell us, how did you get to the St. Hill?
To St. Hill?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a long story. A lot happened between, I went to St. Hill in 64. And what happened there was that I was going to the London organization. I worked in London and went there every evening on a co-audit course. We sat together and co-audited, and this was for untrained people. And this was a very good course. You sat there and listened, and the instructor told you what to talk about, and you talked about it. And the other person just listened. And I was told, they assessed you, and I was assessed for the second dynamic. So I had to talk about the second dynamic. And then after this had gone on for an hour, we changed over. We had a cup of coffee and changed over, and the auditor became the pre-clear. That happened for some time, 3 evenings a week after work. And in the hallway, I saw a notice put up saying they wanted somebody to work at St. Hill. So I applied for that job, and I got the job at St. Hill. So I moved down to St. Hill. So that's the sort of brief story of how I got to St. Hill.
How do you perceive this work in St. Hill in compare with working in other places with non-Scientologists?
Well, it was very interesting to be down at St. Hill. And St. Hill was very small at that time. There were only about, I think there were about 8 people who were Scientologists who worked there. And then there were some gardeners and some staff. So it was right at the beginning of St. Hill. And it was fun working there. It was quite good. They put me on a job of managing the file system and the address system. So and that was interesting. And it wasn't interesting part was that they were running the St. Hill briefing course there. So there were 3 people who were instructing that, and we used to go to the lectures. So that was there.
Thank you. Anthony, you wrote that you was on the first TR's course,
Yeah.
which was delivered. Can you tell us about this course?
Yeah. It was in London, and I was out of work, and I got to join this course, and I think there were 8 people on it. We were told that it was an experiment, and a person by the name of Rosina Mann ran it. And on the course was Mary Sue Hubbard. And the course, nowadays you have TRs 0 to 4. On that course, we had they called it dummy auditing. They didn't call it TR. We had TR 1 to 5. So they were the TR1, which we know it today, originating, TR2 acknowledging, TR3 was repetitive commands, TR4, no, I've lost it. TR4 was all handling originations, and TR5 was dummy auditing. So that meant that you, TR5, you put all the things together and ran a sort of auditing, auditing session, a dummy auditing session. So there was, I think, 8 people on that course, and one of them was Mary Sue. And we had a lady by the name of Rosina Mann who ran it. And she talked to Ron in the evening and about it, and they talked about it. So that was roughly how the thing went.
Thank you. Can you tell us about dummy auditing? What is it?
About what?
Dummy auditing.
Well, it's not. It was what we. Dummy. Okay, sorry, dummy auditing. I think they had a mimicry process. You know, you made a movement, and the pre-clear made the same movement, and we did it like that. And the idea was to practice getting the various dummy as a originating and acknowledging and repeating thing over and over again. Okay. It was completely new, because up to that point you just audited. You didn't have any training in how to speak, so to speak. So this was nowadays we think about the TRs, the training drills. They're part of Scientology, but then they weren't. You didn't have any. It was an innovation, you could say.
Thank you.
Okay.
In our conversation, you mentioned teaching by agreement. Can you tell about this technique?
Yeah.
What is it?
It was in 1956 that Ron gave a lecture in London where he mentioned this, and I found it fascinating. And there came a point where I was out of work, and I was I was painting the staircase in the London organization, and the man called me in and said he had a job for me. And Ron had started an organization in Dublin, in Ireland, and he wanted me to go over and run the organization. The organization was called the American College of Personal Efficiency. It didn't mention Scientology. But anyway, the key part of this was that we ran a course in the evening, which was called a personal efficiency course. It was to make you more efficient. And the basics of that course were the basics of Scientology. And we were taught it in a certain, in a special way. I'll give you an example. There'd be a group of about 10 people, and you would ask one of them, how would you define communication? And that person would give an answer. And then you would say to somebody else, do you agree with that? And you'd get a discussion going on that answer, and you would work towards getting an agreement. You as the instructor would ask people questions and try and get everybody contributing. One of the parts of Scientology is the havingness scale, and high up on the havingness scale is contribute to. So you were getting them participating and being causative and coming to an agreement on on the definition of communication. And you would usually come to you would normally come to something which approximated the Scientology one. You get the idea there?
Thank you. It's very interesting. Antony, what was the difference between Dublin org and London org?
Well, the history behind it is interesting. At a point, Ron was not allowed to live in London, in England, so he moved to Dublin. There was, I don't know why, but there was some problem with getting a visa or something. So he went to Dublin, and when he went to Dublin, he was he was an extremely energetic and busy man. He couldn't just sit there and wait. So he worked and built an organization which pioneered actually this teaching by agreement. And what it was that it was a way of getting people into Scientology. There are certain basics which you can teach. These are the basic things: ARC, 8 dynamics, all these basic things. And he mocked up a course in Dublin in the evenings, which was free and which had a specific way of teaching it. We called it teaching by agreement. You would ask one person, for example, what does reality mean? What is reality? And when that person answered, you would get another person. Would you agree with that? It was teaching by agreement, and you would get the group. Ideally, there was about 10 people, so they all contributed. And contribution is part of the havingness scale. You contribute to things, and you're causative. You're not a dumb person listening. You're causative. You contribute, and the instructor would get different people to contribute their opinion. And while you were doing this, the definition, the Scientology definition for these things is true. So when you get them to define it and discuss it, you would come to that basic truth. And this was done, it was done in the evening, 5 evenings a week, and it covered the basic things like the 8 dynamics, the cycle of action, and things like that. And after a week, they would enroll you on a course which you paid for. And the course you paid for would include, well, it was sciences of survival, the tone scale, and now I'm getting a bit lost on this, but it's what's it doing? Yes, I think you better drop that. Cut this out.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yes, because I'm wondering. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Well, it's a big problem, I think. Because yes, I've gone on from. Oh, that's right. Yes, yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I've lost the whole thing there.
Okay, no problem.
Tell me it's a problem.
It's good. We have different questions, I think, so we can continue with another question. Anthony, is there any difference between present course delivery and how courses was delivered at the very beginning?
Yeah. There was a certain point where check sheets were brought in. The courses in the beginning didn't have check sheets. I taught the HPA course, that's equivalent to the HCA. That was the basic auditor course. I taught that in London, first at the weekends and later during the week. And it had a sort of curriculum, but it worked. It was an 8-week course. The first week you got audited by a student auditor who was graduating. You got a 25-hour intensive from the student. The next week, you did a com course. The week after that, you did a upper in doc course. That's TRs 6 to 9. The week after that, you did auditing. And then you repeated that same thing. Com course for a week, upper in doc for a week, and auditing for a week. You did 2 units of that. That's 2 3-week periods, 6 weeks. And then at the beginning of the course, you got us auditing by a student. And at the end of the 8 weeks, you got to audit a new student sort of thing. So this was a completely different pattern to what we have today. Today, or I don't know about today because I've been thrown out of Scientology 50 years ago. So, but when I was thrown out of Scientology, you had a check sheet, and you had to work through the check sheet, and it took as long as it took. But in that time, I'm talking now about 58. In that time, the course was exactly 8 weeks on that pattern which I've just given you. And the basics was the 2 weeks of com course, 2 weeks of upper in doc course, and 2 weeks of auditing. And then you received you received a session, an intensive, and gave us an intensive. And that was sort of it. And the big change, I don't know when the big change came, but the big change was that check sheets were introduced. So that was.
Thank you.
That was in 1958.
Okay, it's very interesting. Anthony, now I would like to ask you about your project of publishing of original prints of books.
Yeah.
Okay, it's very interesting project because books, we can see that books was not the same all the time.
Mm.
Okay, why you decide to do this project?
Well, as the reason for it really was that Ron, in the beginning, Ron made quite a fuss about the fact that the way to disseminate was with books. You would give a person a book, and the book would, as a the basics are down in the books. I partly started that project because after the church was taken over by David Miscavige or whoever, the books were altered. And I was lucky enough to have a contact. I had a man who had taken all the original books as they came out and made PDF files of them. And this was when it was quite an advanced thing, PDF files. Now anybody can do it. But he made these PDF files, so I had got hold of these and I got these put up. So you have now on my Antology.info, you've got original copies, first editions of nearly all Scientology books. So you've got something there which was the original, not, you can be sure that it hasn't been changed by David Miscavige. Not that I want to mention his name, but he was the man who mucked the whole thing up. So that really is the point, that books on Scientology, you can take it. This is a point that Ron made. You can take a book and sit down and quietly and read it and assimilate it, and you're not having people push their opinions in on you. You can look at the original thing. So that's the sort of story on that.
Thank you. I have a question from our public. There are two books of self-analysis. One is just a self-analysis, and another self-analysis which could be worked with mockups.
Yeah.
And do you know why this second book was removed from the public and not any more published?
No. No. There are two methods of doing it. And I don't know why anyone would stop the one or the other. There's the mock-up and there's the recall. So you could do either. So there have been lots and lots of discussions about what is better and what is worse and so forth. But as far as I can see, both of them are adequate. They're different approaches to the same problem.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Anthony, tell us please your history with L. Ron Hubbard.
Well, I can tell you, I didn't meet him a lot, but there was an occasion when I was on the, I think it was the St. Hill ACC, and he personally assessed everybody for a terminal. They would run a process on a terminal, and he ran this. He assessed me on that, and he assessed a priest. Well, now my Christian background is that I've been involved in the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church has something called the priesthood of all believers, and they didn't believe in priests. So I sort of objected to having a priest as a terminal. So I said this to him, and And he was quite, he's in ARC and so forth. And he said, well, a priest has a longer time track than a minister, and a priest covers a minister. So that was a little encounter there. He handled it with good ARC sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. What about organization? How did the orgs change through the time?
Well, I tell you, the thing that this is a particular thing. Ron set up a 7-division org board. There's a lot you can say about org boards. There was another org board in the London org, but he set up in at St. Hill, and I think it was 67. He set up a 7-division org board. Now I've lost track of this. Sorry, no, I've lost. Yeah.
Okay, it's about organizations.
Yeah. Oh, that was a fantastic thing he did. As I would say, I'm not 100% happy about Ron. He did something. He made a policy which he called "Why Orgs Stay Small." And this is a long policy, but it has 2 sentences which are essential. And that gets lost in the largeness of this policy. And the 2 sentences are in the direction of, I can't recall them verbatim, but the one of them is that an organization is the right size when the leader knows what each of the person in it is doing, and when each person in it is in good terms with the leader. So that gives you an organization is the right size. It's about between 5 and 10 people. And this if you look at the org board is arranged in that session, in that framework. The org board, the 7-division org board, is divided into 2 parts, with an org exec over one side, with 3 or 4 people under, and with an HCO exec on the other side, with 3 or 4 people under. So if you look down the org board, each area has about 5 or 10 people. And this is a funny thing. When I came, I said, this is really mad. When I came to Denmark, I had a contract with the original contract was with St. Hill, but I was now working with Pubs.org, and my contract finished, and I got a free course. No, I got a course on credit on that thing, and if I would never be able to repay that or pay for that course and get a new course. So I had 2 possibilities. I could join the Sea Org, and the Sea Org got all courses for free, or I could get a job outside and pay off my debt, because I had no chance of paying off my debt in Pubs.org. You weren't getting paid enough. And the last thing, this is a bit of a digression, but I'll get to it. The last thing I was going to do at that point was join. This was 1972, probably, just after I'd come to Denmark. I had no chance of paying off my debt if I stayed in pubs or got a job in another org. And the last thing I was going, if I had joined the Sea Org, I'd have got all the courses for free. But the last thing I was going to do was to join the Sea Org, because the way pubs org worked was like the Sea Org in the end. And I wasn't going to, well, the point is, I didn't think I could do that for 1 billion years. I was assigned a contract for 1 billion years. That's the background. When I came out, I started to get into communication with the ordinary Scientologists who weren't org members. And they didn't seem to understand. They were puzzled by the way Scientology organizations worked. So I had a problem. I had a problem that I was in a country which didn't speak English normally, or they did speak English, but you never get to know a country, or this is an overstatement, but you don't really get to know a country if you don't speak its language. If I didn't learn Danish, I would not really be in common with Denmark. So I had one problem, I had to learn Danish. This is my thing. And the other problem, and then they had this problem that they couldn't understand organizations, Scientology organizations. So I thought, I mean, I was sold on the idea of Scientology in all its aspects. And I thought the organization was marvelous, the Ron's organization. I'm not so extreme at the moment. But anyway, I felt I could help these people, Scientologists who were not in the org, by telling them, introducing them to organizations. So I formed a little group, and I called it Scientology Mini Group 1. And Scientology Mini Group 1 was, I had trouble getting, in those days, or certainly there's a policy which says, if you run a group in the field, you have to have it approved by the organization. So I tried to get Scientology Mini Group 1 approved by the AOSH distribution division. And the man, when he saw Mini Group, said, that's not Scientology. We have to be big. So I put this why groups stay small policy letter by Ron and showed it to him. And he didn't really seem convinced. But in the end, he allowed me to have this Scientology Mini Group 1. And we, for the first, we met every week. I went to we had one person who was immobile, was in their house. So I cycled to their house every week, and we held these meetings. And I was learning Danish because I had, the other thing was in Denmark, young people speak English, but the older people, their second language was German. So I had to find people who didn't speak English, and that's difficult. I would go into a shop and say, "What cost a day?" which means, what does that cost? And I get an answer in English. So I had a problem getting Danish people to speak English. So anyway, we held these meetings, and it worked because it was a small group meeting every week, and ARC built up. a large group, it's difficult to get a lot of ARC when it's so large that you don't know the people there. You had to work in small groups. This is what I got out of this why groups stay small. That they must be made up, a large group must be made up of little small cells. Actually, the Methodist Church was built in that fashion. They had classes of 10. And I understand the communists in the beginning worked in small cells. So it's small cells which build a large organization. And now I've lost the track because there's a little funny twist to this in the end. In order to get them to this little Scientology mini group 1, in order to get them familiar with organizations, I worked out a scheme, and we would go around to the there were a number of different organizations and franchises in Denmark. So we went round to each of them and offered to help them for a Saturday. And the Scientology organizations there's a stuck flow. There's a data on flows that if you run a flow for too long, it'll stick. So there was a stuck flow. The organizations were trying to sell to help other people, help other people, help other people. And when somebody came to them saying, can we help you, which is what the Scientology mini group 1 did, they were sort of in a state of shock. What, somebody's trying to help us? So we used to call these, we went to about 7 or 8 different organizations and offered to help them. And we called them shock assists because they got into a state of shock. But that's the story of Scientology mini groups. And it is true that if you want to make something go successfully, get a small group of people enthusiastic about it to work on it. I've forgotten your question, but did it answer that?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Anthony, and the last, my question. When you look on your life, are you happy that you got into the Scientology?
Yeah. It's a long story, but the best thing that ever happened to me was to come into Scientology. But I've gone through so much hell, the hell and damnation. So there have been so many unpleasant experiences in Scientology. But the point is that this is the point, that I've managed to pick out some essential things. If I hadn't come into Scientology, I'm pretty sure I wasn't successful. I was trying to be an optician, but I don't think I'd ever have made it. I don't think I would have lived past 40 or 50. I was really out the bottom. But the one thing is, it's brought me up. It's brought me uptone quite a bit. And the other thing is that I've managed to get out of it valuable material which has kept me alive, which I reckon to keep going for another 10 years. The body is going downhill, but out of Scientology, I've got methods as the Scientology, as the thing which many old people miss is that you have to, if you want to survive, you need to remain cause. And there's a sort of, this isn't a religious thing, there's a sort of general, a fairly general reality that you must take it easy, that you must let other people help you when you get old. You must relax. You must, the other thing, this is a thing of being cause. You must find entertainment. You must get other people to amuse you with films or whatever. I don't, sorry, I'm going on and on about this, but it is my hobby horse, or the bee in my bonnet, that you need to remain cause as a, and this is essentially out of what I got out of part of what I got out of Scientology. So they, I don't regret going into Scientology. So sort of that's the sort of answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anthony. Okay, thank you for your interview, that you find the time for us, and I wish you all the best, and see you maybe next time. Yeah. Keep hang on to Scientology. Okay, thank you very much then. Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.